Hello, today I'm continuing my look at the Tekken series with a look at the pivotal female lead of 1995's Tekken 2, Jun Kazama. Now, of all the Tekken characters to have featured throughout the series, Jun is one that has consistently intrigued me because, much like Ancient Ogre, who I recently discussed, her single canonical appearance has had huge implications and repercussions over subsequent games and storylines, the most obvious being the conception and nurturing of the now lead character Jin Kazama. But also, like Ancient Ogre, there are many aspects of her personality and backstory that remain quite enigmatic and open to interpret, most specifically the precise nature of her relationship with Kazuya Mishima, and also her final fate and whether she lives or dies, and the prospect of her return in a later installment. So, many interesting things and stuff to unpack and speculate on around Jun Kazama. And jumping right in, looking to Jun's debut back in Tekken 2, there was little indication at the time as to the role she would play within the story and the impact she would have on later titles, with the only inkling being this dramatic cinematic in the opening FMV, which sees the camera zoom in on Jun from above as she looks fatedly up into the sky. But besides this, the premise for her entry into Tekken 2, the tournament, was as an animal rights operative who enters the tournament to apprehend Kazuya Mishima for animal smuggling and experimentation, which incidentally ties into the weirdness of Roger and Alex, the secret characters, who are genetic bioweapons made by the Zaibatsu. But aside from Jun's inclusion, and looking more broadly at Tekken 2, it is a game that is very much hinged around the moral fight for Kazuya's soul, and as the opening FMV and the final boss segments of arcade mode show, the angel character and the devil character are very much in the mix and the focal point of the primary story arc, and the dark aesthetic vibe that very much encapsulates Tekken 2. And while many feel that Jun's presence and proximity to Kazuya evoked the angel character's appearance, I always personally felt that Angel was more of a metaphorical character, because there's no canonical cause for its appearance, and it only appears very translucently, embracing Kazuya in the introduction. But nonetheless, I really felt that the dynamic of the angel and the demon wrestling over the fate of Kazuya was a really strong theme for the second game. And regardless of how we want to interpret the particular roles of Jun, the angel, the devil, and Kazuya, I do feel that it was a really solid arc, despite the ambiguities around it. And I think it was a stronger story to have continued and explored, rather than retconning and bringing in the Devil Jin theme. Now, despite the in-game ambiguities around Jun, and particularly how the relationship between Jun and Kazuya actually came about and was fostered, because they are evidently quite contrary personalities and characters, a yin and yang of order and chaos, of pure and impure, the closest we've come to having this relationship explored and explained to us is 1997's Tekken the Motion Picture, which hinged around Kazuya's salvation at the hands of Jun, and his tumultuous relationship with his father Heihachi. And as I stated in my Tekken Bloodline review, I think this was a pretty solid story and explainer for how these two characters encountered one another and grew close to one another, because Jun, being this righteous embodiment of selflessness, which carries over from her Tekken 2 appearance, and for example her ending animation conveys that very strongly, I think it was great, and it's made very clear that she is a personality that identifies the elements of good in Kazuya and the elements of good in people, which perhaps nobody else can. And I thought that was pretty good, and my only real reticence about her inclusion in the motion picture was that it showed her and Kazuya as childhood friends, and her witnessing him being thrown from the cliff by Heihachi. And it's not necessarily a terrible thing to have included, but it did feel a little bit contrived, and there was no real reason for it to be there. Now, moving on to Tekken 3, we've naturally reached the end of Jun's canonical inclusion, but her legacy lives on in the games, and it's amazing to think that Tekken 2 came out in 1995, and we're still discussing the repercussions of her inclusion and her plotline. But her legacy does live on, and primarily so through her son Jin Kazama and his own arc, which, after pursuing Ogre to discover what became of his mother, sees him enter a tumultuous relationship with his grandfather Heihachi and his father Kazuya. And as many have astutely pointed out, ultimately he has this sort of conflict with himself too, and this enduring dichotomy between good and evil, pure and impure, which is embodied by his mother and his father. and is a very interesting thread of his personal arc that continues to unfold in the Tekken saga. So, I suppose coming to the Tekken story as a whole, and the ambiguous demise of Jun Kazama, it's really interesting to see and read and hear the opinions of fans, and how many people actually feel that her disappearance was final. And indeed, even Harada himself has stated in an old tweet that Jun was written out of the series due to a poor reception with players, which I not only slightly disagree with from my own recollections, but also, even if that were the case and Jun was unpopular at the time of Tekken 2's release, such has been the appeal that has built up around the mystery of Jun and the subsequent story of Jin, I think there's a strong case to suggest that her popularity has resurged in recent years. And for example, she was one of the most anticipated features and inclusions of the later Tekken tag games. So clearly I think she's had something of a renaissance with fans, if indeed they did dislike her at the time. But sticking specifically with the story and looking at Tekken narratively, if we consider all of the combatants that Ogre has fought and made disappear prior to the events of Tekken 3, Bruce Irvin, Bake, Wang, Iron King, Kunimitsu, Lee Chaolan, and so on, they've all subsequently reappeared in later canonical games. And so I'm really surprised how dismissive people are about Jun having the potential, to be gone forever. And I raise this now in particular because following the close of Tekken 7, which saw the demise of Heihachi, we are left with a very clear pair of characters on the centre stage, which is Kazuya Mishima and Jin Kazama, which the close of Tekken 7 began to position as an ultimate showdown that would be coming in what we can assume will be the next instalment, Tekken 8. And for a number of reasons, I think Jun Kazama could be a worthy element to reintroduce in Tekken 8 or beyond, because looking back across the series, the animosity between father and son in the Heihachi and the Kazuya feud played out very well and came to a logical conclusion. And so to do the same with Kazuya and Jin would arguably prove quite a contrived and repetitive story, so there's an opportunity to change that up a bit. Furthermore, one thing that's been increasingly eroded since Tekken 4 and beyond is that Kazuya has the potential for goodness. That's what his entire character and conflict in Tekken 2 hinges around. And regardless of the Devil Gene story or the original Devil story where Kazuya sells his soul, in both instances he is a victim of circumstance, looked at a certain way. And at the hands of his father, he became a very warped individual, became a victim and became a villain, owing to everything that's happened to him at the hands of Heihachi. So personally, I think with Heihachi gone, there's opportunity to reintroduce this earlier aspect of Kazuya, rather than continue down the path of his arbitrary evilness. And I think the character that could add complexity and depth to that, who could finally clarify past events and bridge the divide between Kazuya and Jin, and perhaps draw the devil out of Kazuya, becoming an external entity again, to ultimately try and challenge. This could be Jun Kazama. So that's my take on it, and my 2 cents worth from purely a narrative perspective, and what I think could make it quite an interesting and innovative story. Because I don't think it makes sense to have Jun disappear forever, despite some of the afterlife allusions that we get from Tekken 6 dialogues and Tekken Tag ending animations. And equally, it makes no sense for Kazuya and Jin to follow in the footsteps of Heihachi and Kazuya's early story, with an arbitrarily evil patriarch and a vengeful son. But at the end of the day, it is Tekken. It does have a penchant for craziness. We'll have to see what they come up with for Tekken 8. And I suppose the only other point regarding Jun story-wise is that the Tekken Bloodline series, if it does indeed have a Season 2, it does seem primed to explore the backstory of Kazuya and Jun more thoroughly. And as I mentioned in my Jin episode, it's possible that we may see more context around how Kazuya and Jun meet, and how this relationship came about. Finally, before wrapping up, it's worth touching on Jun Kazama's design and combat style. And at the time of Tekken 2, she, along with Lei Wulong, Bruce Irvin and Bake, were inclusions that boasted the more fluid movesets and potential for chain combos that Tekken would eventually move towards. And interestingly, despite the relative infancy of 3D fighting games and complex fighting games at the time, she could be used in a much more strategic and defensive way across the 3D plane, which was later developed and dialed up for her embellished movesets in the Tekken tag games. In terms of visual design, Jun is certainly more nondescript than the other motley characters of the Tekken franchise, but this nonetheless emphasises a simplicity and purity in her light-coloured basic attire that I think purposefully contrasts her with the bombast and the weirdness of other characters in the roster. And it was only Tekken Tag 2 that divorced her slightly from this earlier simplicity, with slightly more embellished and symbolic outfits and colourways that seem to visually bridge her with some of the motifs that are present in Jin, and also arguably Kazuya. So that about wraps up my brief look at Jun Kazama, a very interesting and fleeting inclusion to the Tekken series that has had huge influence over the course of the story, and added more complexity and depth to two key characters in Kazuya and Jin. The plight of inner conflict within Kazuya, and later his son, make Jun's appearance, particularly in broader media such as the motion picture and Tekken Bloodline, all the more important. And while it is perhaps unlikely that she will make a return anytime soon, I think owing to her importance embodying the fundamental purity and goodness in people, there is a solid case as to why she should perhaps make subsequent appearances, whether that's by flashback or in person in Tekken 8 and beyond. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you haven't already, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and check out the other Tekken episodes that are available on the channel.